As I said at the beginning of this review, BioShock has taken most of its gameplay elements from System Shock 2, but one notably absent element is the inventory. In System Shock 2, you could only carry so much, strength being the determining factor. This put you in many a difficult position, as you had to decide whether you carried, say, this weapon you just found, or dropped it in favour of something else, which maybe wasn't immediately useful now, unlike the weapon, but would be important later on. You also had to consider spending your precious experience points on increasing your strength at the cost of other statistics and abilities to be able to carry the things you needed to survive. The whole game was a million little choices that you had to make, and these choices very much put you in control of the experience. Similarly, weapons were split into categories. Standard weapons, exotic weapons, and so forth, and you need to be adept to varying degrees in the field of weaponry to use certain weapons in that field. This meant that not only could you not carry around every weapon you found, like in BioShock, you couldn't even necessarily use them. BioShock totally dumbs it down. There are 8 or 9 weapons, and you can carry them all with no restrictions, and use them all perfectly well. Health and EV hypos can be carried, but are limited to 9 each. Money can be carried, but you're limited to no more than $500. And because of the abundance of such items, you'll rarely not be at the maximum carry capacity, able to easily afford whatever you want. And the few other items that exist in the world, things like alcohol that increase health and decrease EVE, or cigarettes that increase EVE and decrease health, which is straight out of System Shock, are consumed immediately, rather than being storable for later use. There are also trash items you can collect and convert into ammo at certain stations, which rewards exploration, but doesn't force the player to make interesting choices. The lack of the inventory takes the burden of choice away from the player, making for a pasteurized, vanilla experience. The only real restriction the game puts on you comes in the form of plasmids and gene tonic slots. You only have so many of each, with additional slots having to be bought and paid for with Adam, but because of the player-friendly way the game is crafted, you can easily get enough without having to make any meaningful sacrifices that would affect how the game plays. And because of the extreme overlap with plasmids, you don't need to bother buying most of them anyway. One of the role-playing elements of System Shock 2 that has been carried over in a good way is research. In Shock 2 you could increase your efficiency against certain enemies by researching the organs they sometimes dropped, and certain items could not be used without first researching them. Research in Shock 2 required certain items found in chemical storerooms, and because it wasn't practical to carry these items around, this led to a lot of backtracking that could be considered laborious, though I liked it. In BioShock, you research by taking photographs of enemies. There are a number of very cool aspects to this, not the least of which being that it makes research an actual gameplay element. You snap photos of enemies to research them, with pictures of enemies in action and pictures featuring multiple enemies providing bonuses. Dead enemies are less valuable as photo targets, and the film used to take the picture is a finite resource, so you can't be all that click happy, which is pretty cool, though you can always buy more film. The photographs really epitomise BioShock's design philosophy, to make players play an intelligent game with RPG mechanics without making them realise it, rather to make them think they are playing a dumb FPS. And of course, for the most part, Irrational went way too far, and most of BioShock's RPG elements are varying degrees of self-sabotaging or game ruining. But with research, like with gene tonics, they really hit the nail on the head. And gene banks are research's antithesis, where research effectively takes an RPG mechanic and adapts it for a first-person shooter. Gene banks just ruin the game. The gene bank is where all the plasmids and gene tonics you're not using are stored. Throughout most of the game you're given more tonics and plasmids than you can actually use due to slot limitations, but rather than having to make permanent and therefore meaningful choices, as in Shock 2, you can easily swap out your abilities at one of the numerous conveniently placed gene banks. It's like respecing in an RPG or MMO, except you can do it as often as you want, with no cost, and the game encourages it. And while respecing has become a standard element of certain RPGs, it makes sense in them because players dedicate hundreds or thousands of hours to their characters. It has no place in BioShock because BioShock is a linear, 8-hour experience. These gene banks undermine the very essence of the RPG experience, which is fundamentally one of choice. The choices you make in the way you build your character, and in how these things affect your experience with the world and the characters therein. And if BioShock was played as a straight-up shooter, then fine, I could overlook this, but the game puts so much effort into pushing these underdeveloped and self-sabotaging role-playing mechanics. There are a couple of perfect examples of why gene banks spoil the game. In one instance, an item is frozen, stuck in ice. The only way you can get the item is by melting the ice with your flame plasmid, so only people who have that plasmid can melt the ice and get the item inside, which in this case is a gene tonic, the possession of which would have a meaningful impact on the rest of the game experience. But absolutely everyone who plays the game will get it, because everyone has flame. You can't get to that point and not have it. What's worse, the game puts a gene bank right next to the ice, just in case you don't have the flame plasmid equipped. Another plasmid is telekinesis, which can be used to hurl things at enemies, but it can also be used to collect otherwise out of reach objects. In System Shock 2, having telekinesis will always come at the expense of other abilities and statistics, so many players would never actually get telekinesis throughout the course of the game. This means that players that have it will be collecting different resources, perhaps more resources, than those who don't have it, and on the harder difficulty levels, resources are so limited that this has an enormous impact on the game. BioShock similarly has items that are hidden and can only be collected with telekinesis. But because all players are given the plasmid, and because plasmids can easily be swapped out at gene banks, the game completely undermines itself. BioShock is a dumb, bland, one-size-fits-all experience, and gene banks are one of the major culprits as to why. But gene banks aren't the only guilty party. There's also hacking. Hacking played a large role in System Shock 2, at least it did if you built a character around it. It was one of the many viable character builds. In BioShock, everyone can hack everything. Everyone can get access to the same resources by hacking safes, and everyone can get sentry guns on their side by hacking them. But the thing that annoys me most is that, if you're spotted by a security camera, and these cameras have spotlights attached by the way, the game kindly babying you so you know exactly what they're looking at, but if you are spotted, a little helicopter gun thingy is sent after you. This is ridiculous because, like the sentry guns, you can easily disable them with an electro bolt and then hack them to bring them over to your side. So, as punishment for being spotted by a camera, the game rewards you with a fairly powerful companion. I'm not going to criticise the actual hacking minigame itself. When you open the hack window, which by the way pauses the game, which is awful, you're presented with a bunch of squares. Behind each square is a tube piece, and your goal is to make a tube that runs from one end to the other, the twist being that the water begins flowing as soon as you start. This means you have to flip all the tiles over as quickly as you can and start building your tube at the same time, which theoretically could lead to some extreme tension, as some of the hacks are pretty difficult. But again, BioShock has dumbed itself down too far. Unless you set off an alarm by running your water current through an easily avoidable alarm square, all that happens if you fail a hack is you get a little electric shock, which hurts a bit. The shock will never actually kill you, so if you have very low health, there's effectively no punishment for failure, and even if you don't, the punishment is so insignificant because of how abundant resources are in the game. In System Shock 2, not only does hacking require a certain statistic, meaning your experience is determined by your choices, every hack attempt costs you the game's equivalent of money. This means every attempt you make, and you will likely have to make several attempts each time, will cost you, and you will end up asking yourself if the cost justifies the gain, and often you'll find it doesn't, adding further depth to the game. What's more, while the hacking minigame in Shock 2 is very basic, the game doesn't pause, which adds a lot of tension to the hack, as you're totally vulnerable to attack while hacking. Tension is upped even more with the inclusion of squares that have a chance to cause an immediate failure if they don't turn out the way you want. This means you'll often choose to risk destroying a vending machine or setting off an alarm to save yourself the precious money that is so important in the game, yet again giving you meaningful choices to make. BioShock's hacking is completely lacking in all tension, making the game a flat, bland experience in yet another way. And just to reiterate this, the game pauses when you hack. That means any enemies nearby will, in real terms, be standing around waiting for you to finish your hacking before they resume attacking you. It's ridiculous.